2018 is not the time for Nintendo to start thinking about Nintendo Switch hardware revisions. Hell, 2019 might not be. A sizable amount of the Nintendo community here on YouTube seems to think that Switch is destined for all sorts of 3DS-like upgrades. I think that that would be dumb and would ultimately hinder the success of Nintendo Switch. They should definitely stay away from that sort of thing, at least this early on in its life, or for the first few years of its life. Based on the fact that Nintendo has confirmed that they intend to prioritize peripherals over hardware revisions with Switch, I would say that they seem to be along the same lines of thinking as me. But why is that? What makes Nintendo Switch so different from the past handhelds? Even their most recent handhelds with the 3DS, the new. For as long as Nintendo has been making handhelds, they've been iterating on those handhelds, sometimes yearly. So when fans say they feel Nintendo is going to do something along those lines with Nintendo Switch, I can at least see where their line of thinking is coming from. But I'd argue that logic doesn't really apply with the situation Switch is currently in. After all, Nintendo almost never revises their home consoles, with the exception of NES, SNES, and Wii, all of which received cheaper to manufacture versions to help reinvigorate sales. Many of the Switch revisions being suggested by fans will either achieve the opposite of this, or they would contradict the Switch's mission statement in the process of making it cheaper. One of the more popular concepts that comes to mind is the Switch Mini. The biggest problem with this concept is that it completely changes the point of Switch in every way. Just think of how Nintendo markets Nintendo Switch. It's the console you can play anywhere with anyone. This Switch Mini concept cuts that tagline in half and adds nothing. The counter argument many like to present in favor of this concept is the fact that Nintendo ultimately backpedaled a major intended selling point of 3DS with the release of 2DS. This comparison, I would say, is ultimately poorly thought out. First of all, yes, for 3DS, when it was initially announced, a big part of its pitch was its ability to play games in stereoscopic, glasses-free 3D. Many of the games on 3DS were developed with this in mind. A lot of the Nintendo developed games even were better in 3D. Despite this, the feature ultimately wasn't embraced by anyone, not developers, not fans. There was a few guys, maybe you in the comments, who's ultimately going to say, oh, was it Nintendo? Anyway, for the most part, most people didn't play in 3D. From day one, Nintendo slapped a warning label on every retail game released for 3DS, stating games should not be played in 3D by anyone under the age of 7. That's a sizable portion of Nintendo's target audience being told not to use a feature that wasn't exactly free to implement. Not only that, but devs struggled to make games run well in 3D in the first place, since the effect requires the games to be rendered twice. This affected the frame rate most notably in a lot of different games. And all of that is before we even mention the fact that the older gaming market didn't exactly embrace the feature either. All of that without a doubt made the decision to put the feature on the back burner that much easier. The 2DS is something that fulfills a need that is ultimately still in line with the current appeal of the rest of the 3DS line. Just more accessible for children in form factor, price point, and it forgoes the feature that may ultimately harm their eyes while they're still developing, and a lot of people outside of that age group didn't really like to begin with. So what is the Switch Mini's problem? Well, that depends on which version of the pitch you've seen, but the basic gist of the concept is to axe the dock, axe the Joy-Con, make the screen smaller, add a D-pad, and drop the price by $100. In theory, this sounds cool for the subsect of Switch owners that care about that sort of thing, or rather don't care about those things and all. But the implementation of the dock, for one, is a feature that many use almost exclusively. I personally only recently purchased a Pro controller and started using my Switch docked more often, but I know personally a sizable amount of Switch owners that haven't once undocked their Switch since they've gotten it.
Outlier. I play my Switch almost exclusively in docked mode.
I'm aware this is all anecdotal, and I usually try to make a point to present backing to whatever arguments I make in these videos, so with that being said, Nintendo posted data on how people have been playing Switch. That data is up on screen now. According to these graphics, the vast majority of Switch owners play docked and undocked equally, so hindering their access to one or the other, or requiring separate purchases that would ultimately net out to an amount eclipsing the current price of Switch, defeating the purpose. And that's before considering the fact that the current form factor for Switch already suffers with battery life. Taking away real estate that can be used for the battery is a bad idea. Also, who's to say cramming the Switch's internals into a smaller body wouldn't cause overheating issues? Really, this thing presents more problems than it solves, and the initial savings don't really end up being worth it. Aside from that, the Joy-Con and their features are a major focus of Nintendo's strategy for Nintendo Switch, and that goes far beyond the sharing the joy aspect of the controllers that so many people seem to be indifferent towards. Removing them from a Switch SKU would ultimately limit the amount of games that are playable on it, and the players that would normally want to play the games that they would be missing out on would be the ones that also would benefit most from this revision: kids. Sure, you may get more kids with the deceiving, quote, lower price point, but those kids would ultimately be walled out from having things like Labo and other games that Nintendo clearly plans to make that use the unique features of the Joy-Con. Even if the console concept is compatible with Joy-Con, the need to purchase them separately would all but erase the budget price, and that's before, again, buying the dock. Beyond that, it takes away an aspect of portability given the fact that the Joy-Con wouldn't be attachable. Also, other accessories that could make use of the Switch's rails would be completely incompatible with this thing. The only problem a Switch Mini would potentially solve is a problem that will eventually solve itself as Switch ages. The price will go down, just like every console before it. Nintendo is in no rush to make this happen though, and as long as 3DS is around and printing them free money, there is no need for them to start rushing it. Also, they only recently really got the hang of supplying this SKU of Switch. You really think adding another one would improve sales at all? I doubt it. If anything, it would bottleneck them and present the possibility of a supply-demand issue in the opposite direction. How many people really have the problem that the Switch Mini would attempt to solve for Switch? Would it really be worth the trouble? I somehow doubt it. So what about the other way around? Why not make a Switch XL? Well, for one, it's too early. Making a Switch with a 1080p screen is technically possible given the fact that Switch is already capable of running games in 1080p when docked. The dock itself has nothing to do with that ability, at least currently. The main bottleneck here is the battery. If they allowed games to run at their full potential when undocked, it would die significantly faster than it already does, and it would be at least mildly uncomfortable to hold due to the increased heat. Of course, increasing the size of the console would alleviate at least the heat issue, but it would likely minimize the portability factor in the process. None of this is to say XL is as, frankly, nonsensical as the Switch Mini. I actually believe this would be the smartest option, but I think there's a missing link here that could make upgrading a much more cost-effective pill that's a hell of a lot easier to swallow. Nintendo should start with the dock. We already know that they have been thinking about ways to increase the capabilities of their console's hardware without requiring us to buy a whole new one for some time now. Ever since the SNES, Nintendo has been introducing accessories that improve the capabilities of their machines. And leading into Switch's launch, we learned that Nintendo hasn't lost the desire to make that happen with Switch by way of their supplemental computing patent. Now, before I go any further, keep in mind that I am fully aware that Nintendo's patents aren't always indicative of what they have in the pipeline, but a lot of times they are. Actually, every time they are thinking of a feature to implement, there will be a patent that follows. That's how patents work. Take this patent that details the Joy-Con, or their abilities, including their detachable nature, the ability to use them as individual controllers, the IR sensor, and more. All of that is to say, I can see this patent being put to use for the Switch in the future. What I'm getting at is, I think Nintendo will first release an updated version of the dock before they upgrade the tablet itself. A new dock, even at nearly twice the price of the current price, in the $150 ballpark with additional processing power, affording the ability for Switch games to render in 4K, maybe render more detailed textures and run games better, would be more than welcome by people that care about that sort of thing. And it wouldn't have to cost them an arm and a leg like a new tablet would. This approach would also buy Nintendo, and more importantly, Nvidia, more time to come out with better processors for the next generation of Switch tablets, and release them at a reasonable price. This release pattern at a frequency of each update happening about every 4 years or so, i.e. new dock in 2020, new tablet in 2024, so on and so forth, would also be in line with their vision of a NX family of consoles. And it would also line up with their claim that their peripheral plan will include the USB-C port. That is how the dock works after all. In the meantime, Switch will be kept fresh with the normal games we've been receiving, experiments like Labo, and a bunch of stuff in between. Nintendo isn't in need of extra horsepower, and we won't really be in a position for third parties to need more horsepower until 2019 at the earliest. Nintendo won't be providing them with 64GB carts until then, so the more ambitious titles will surely be on hold until then as well. I'm not one for specs in the way a lot of gamers seem to be, so I'll be happy with my OG Switch and can wait patiently for whatever upgrades we may get. Some people may be against the current price because of their aversion to the Joy-Con, or the people that feel they shouldn't have to pay for the dock if they choose not to use it, but that's not how console gaming works. If you want something that modular, stick with PC. Especially when we take all of that in combination with Nintendo's intent to prolong the Switch's life cycle up to 10 years, and their aforementioned plan to prioritize peripherals over hardware upgrades. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? Does Switch need a Switch XL, a Switch Mini, or will we be fine with peripherals keeping the Nintendo Switch fresh? Let me know in the comments, and while you're down there, don't forget to like or dislike accordingly, subscribe if you haven't already, share this video with a friend, ring the bell so you and them can be notified when a new video goes up every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. If you like podcasts, we also have those. They go up every Saturday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Why not click one of the videos in this here end card? Especially the one on the left. That's a good one. Okay, that's it for me. See you next week.